Imagine you've spent 10, maybe 15 years learning to walk a tightrope. You know exactly how much balance you need, you know the wind speed, you've got your technique down to a science. You are, for all intents and purposes, an expert tightrope walker. And then one day, without any warning, someone changes the tension of the rope. Maybe they shake the platform. Suddenly, the techniques that kept you safe for a decade stop working. You're wobbling, you're falling, and the people watching from the ground shout up, "Hey, why are you struggling? You've been doing this for years. You should be used to it by now."
That is such a visceral image, Chloe, and it is unfortunately the exact reality for thousands of women living with adrenal insufficiency when they hit their 40s and 50s.
It's terrifying. We are talking about a collision today that is rarely discussed in medical offices, but is absolutely devastating in real life. We're looking at what happens when adrenal insufficiency, a condition where your body doesn't make enough cortisol, collides head-on with perimenopause and menopause.
Right, and we are basing this conversation on a really crucial article titled My Adrenal Life, Adrenal Insufficiency During Perimenopause and Menopause. It tackles this pervasive myth that if you were stable before, you should stay stable. But biology doesn't work that way.
Exactly. So, Alex, let's start with that myth. I think that's the source of so much pain here. The idea that stability is a permanent state.
It is harmful, frankly. Adrenal insufficiency, or AI, whether it's Addison's disease or secondary AI, requires a patient to manually replace the cortisol their body can't make. They take pills every day to mimic a rhythm their body has lost. When a woman is in her 20s or 30s, her background hormonal landscape, her estrogen and progesterone, is relatively rhythmic. It's predictable. So she figures out her cortisol dose and she feels stable.
She's mastered the tightrope.
Precisely. But perimenopause is not a gentle decline. It is chaotic. It involves massive spikes and drops in estrogen and progesterone. And here is the key takeaway for today. Cortisol does not exist in a vacuum. It is swimming in the same pool as these other hormones. When the water gets choppy, the cortisol doesn't work the same way.
So let's break down the how. The article mentions something that I found fascinating: cortisol binding proteins. This feels like the technical smoking gun here. Can you explain what's happening in the blood when estrogen starts fluctuating?
This is the mechanism that explains why you can feel terrible even if you haven't changed your medication dose. So, in your blood, cortisol often travels attached to a protein called cortisol-binding globulin, or CBG. Think of CBG as a taxi cab. When cortisol is inside the taxi, it's not active. It's just circulating, waiting to be dropped off. It only becomes active when it steps out of the cab.
Okay, so we have free cortisol, the active stuff, and bound cortisol, the passenger in the taxi.
Right. Now here is the kicker. Estrogen increases the number of taxis. It increases the production of CBG. So in a normal physiological state, if your estrogen spikes, which happens frequently in the early stages of perimenopause, your liver pumps out more CBG.
So suddenly, there are way more taxis on the road picking up all the cortisol.
Exactly. And if you are a person with a healthy adrenal system, your brain notices this and says, hey, too much cortisol is stuck in taxis. We need more free cortisol. And your adrenals pump out more to compensate. But if you have adrenal insufficiency,
You can't pump out more. You just took your 10 milligrams hydrocortisone tablet at 8 a.m., and that's all you've got.
bingo, you took your pill, but suddenly, because of an estrogen spike, a huge chunk of that medication gets bound up in these proteins. Ideally, it eventually releases, but the timing is off. The availability is altered. You might feel symptoms of low cortisol, fatigue, nausea, brain fog, even though you took your medication. And the reverse happens too. If estrogen drops, you have fewer taxis, and you might feel slightly over-replaced or wired.
It's like the currency exchange rate is changing every hour, but your salary stays the same. You never know how much purchasing power your cortisol actually has.
That is a brilliant analogy. And remember, perimenopause can last anywhere from 4 to 10 years. This isn't a week of bad sleep. This is years of shifting exchange rates.
The article also touches heavily on the emotional aspect. And I want to be careful here because, as women, we are so often told it's just anxiety or it's all in your head. But the piece argues that for AI patients, this anxiety is physiological, not just psychological.
This is a critical distinction. We need to talk about progesterone. In the female body, progesterone isn't just a reproductive hormone, it's a neurosteroid. When it breaks down, it creates a metabolite called allopregnenolone. This interacts with GABA receptors in the brain, the same receptors that anti-anxiety medications like Xanax or Valium target.
So progesterone is basically nature's Valium.
Essentially, yes. It has a soothing, calming effect. In perimenopause, progesterone is often the first hormone to drop, and it drops hard, so you lose that natural buffer. For a woman with adrenal insufficiency, whose body is already struggling to regulate stress response because of the cortisol issues, losing that progesterone buffer is like taking the insulation off a live wire.
And that creates this sensation described in the text as anxiety that feels physical. Can we unpack that? Because I think a lot of listeners might recognize that feeling without having a name for it.
Yes, psychological anxiety usually has a narrative. You're worried about your job, your kids, money. There's a story attached to the fear. Physical anxiety, or what we often see in cortisol dysregulation, is body first. It's a racing heart, a tightness in the chest, a feeling of doom or shaking, but your mind is blank. You're sitting on the couch watching a comedy, and your body feels like it's being hunted by a bear.
That is such a validating distinction because if you go to a doctor with those symptoms and they don't understand the AI component, they prescribe an SSRI.
Right, and while mental health support is great, an SSRI doesn't fix a cortisol deficit or a progesterone crash. The article emphasizes that this emotional volatility, tearfulness, irritability, low stress tolerance, is a biological response to a changing environment, not a personality flaw.
I want to pivot to the three-legged stool concept mentioned in our research for this. We have the adrenals, the ovaries, and the thyroid. The article mentions thyroid interactions specifically. Why is the thyroid getting dragged into this mess?
Because the endocrine system is a web, not a series of boxes. We know that autoimmune conditions like to cluster. A huge percentage of women with Addison's disease also have Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It's often called Schmidt syndrome or autoimmune polyglandular syndrome type 2.
So they're already juggling two replacements, thyroid hormone and cortisol.
Correct. And just like estrogen affects cortisol-binding proteins, it also affects thyroid-binding globulins, or TBG. So high estrogen binds up more thyroid hormone, making less available. During midlife, as estrogen fluctuates, your thyroid medication might suddenly feel ineffective or too strong. And here's the catch. Cortisol is required for the conversion of T4, the storage thyroid hormone, into T3, the active hormone. If your cortisol is unstable because of perimenopause, your thyroid conversion efficiency drops.
It's a domino effect. The ovaries shake the adrenals shake the thyroid, and the patient is left exhausted, freezing cold, or losing their hair, and all their labs might look technically in range.
That is the most frustrating part. You go to the endocrinologist, they run a TSH and a total cortisol. The total cortisol looks normal because the CBG is high. Remember the taxis. The lab counts the cortisol in the taxis. It doesn't tell you how much is actually getting to the cells. So the doctor says, you're fine. Maybe you're just depressed.
God, that is infuriating. It brings us back to that line in the article, worsening symptoms during this stage are not a personal failure.
But it's hard not to feel like a failure when the medical data doesn't back up your lived experience.
It requires a level of self-advocacy that is exhausting for someone who is already fatigued. We also have to talk about temperature regulation, because this is a huge quality of life issue. We associate hot flashes with menopause, obviously, but for an AI patient, a hot flash isn't just a moment of feeling warm.
Right. The article mentions heat intolerance appearing or worsening. What is the difference between a menopausal hot flash and an adrenal heat crash?
Adrenal supports vascular tone. It keeps your blood vessels behaving correctly. When you overheat, your body demands cortisol to help manage the stress of cooling down, vasodilatation, sweating, heart rate changes. If you are adrenal insufficient, you don't have that extra reserve of cortisol to handle the heat stress. So a hot flash can trigger a mini adrenal crisis. You get dizzy, you might feel nauseous, your blood pressure might drop. It drains your battery much faster than it would for a woman without AI.
So a hot flash becomes a medical event, essentially.
It becomes a cortisol draining event. And if you are having night sweats, you are waking up depleted. You are starting your day in a deficit. And sleep disruption is arguably the biggest destabilizer for AI patients.
Because of the circadian rhythm?
Exactly. The circadian rhythm is governed by cortisol and melatonin. If you aren't sleeping because of low estrogen or night sweats, your body is under physical stress all night. You wake up needing more cortisol just to get to baseline, but your prescription is the same as it was 5 years ago. It's a recipe for chronic exhaustion.
This paints a really complex picture. It's not just one thing going wrong. It's the interaction of 3 or 4 systems. So if I'm listening to this and I have adrenal insufficiency and I'm 45 and I feel like I'm losing my mind, what is the path forward? The article mentions understanding these shifts to replace self-blame with clarity, but practically, what does that look like?
First, it means redefining what stable means. Stability in midlife might look different than stability in your 30s. It might mean your dosing needs to be more flexible. Some endocrinologists are starting to recognize that women might need a slight updose, a small bump in cortisol, during the premenstrual phase or during periods of intense perimenopausal symptoms.
Treating the symptoms as a physiological stressor that requires coverage.
Yes, just like you would updose for a fever or a dental procedure. Severe sleep deprivation and severe thermal dysregulation are stressors. Now, this is controversial. Not every doctor agrees with updosing for life stuff, but the quality of life argument is strong. Secondly, many women find relief by addressing the sex hormones directly.
You mean HRT?
Exactly. For a long time, women were scared off HRT, but for AI patients, smoothing out those estrogen and progesterone fluctuations can essentially stop the earthquake shaking the tightrope. If you stabilize the background hormones, your cortisol replacement becomes predictable again.
But there's a catch there too, right? Because of the delivery method.
You catch on quick. Yes, if you take oral estrogen, pills, it is processed through the liver. This triggers that massive increase in cortisol-binding globulin we talked about earlier. So oral estrogen can actually make the cortisol availability problem worse initially.
So transdermal is better?
Generally, yes. Patches, gels, or sprays bypass the liver first-pass metabolism. They don't spike the binding globulins nearly as much. So for a woman with adrenal insufficiency, transdermal HRT is often the preferred route to avoid messing up her cortisol absorption.
That is such a specific, actionable detail that I bet a lot of general practitioners wouldn't think of.
They often don't. They might treat the menopause and the AI as 2 separate countries on a map, not realizing they share a border and a currency.
We've covered the biology, the binding proteins, the thyroid overlap, and the emotional gaslighting. But I want to go back to the human elements the article closes with. You are not failing. You are not weak.
That's the most important part. Adrenal insufficiency is an invisible disability. You look fine, and because you've managed it for years, people around you, even your family, forget that you are manually operating your own life support system every single day. When that system starts glitching because of menopause, the internal pressure to just push through is immense. But pushing through when you have no cortisol is physically impossible. It's like trying to drive a car with no gas. It doesn't matter how much willpower you have, the engine won't turn over.
And the danger of pushing through is a crisis.
Right. An adrenal crisis is life-threatening. So this isn't just about comfort, it's about safety. Acknowledging that your body has changed, that the rules of the tightrope have changed, is a survival strategy. It validates that you might need more rest, you might need different meds, and you definitely need more compassion from yourself.
It challenges the narrative of the stoic survivor. I feel like in the chronic illness community, there is status in being the good patient who doesn't complain. But perimenopause requires you to be the noisy patient.
Be noisy, absolutely. Bring the articles, bring the research about cortisol-binding globulin. Ask about transdermal hormones. Ask for a thyroid panel that includes free T3, not just TSH. The physiology is real. The article states clearly, adrenal insufficiency is particularly sensitive to these changes. That is a biological fact, not a complaint.
I think this conversation is going to be a light bulb moment for so many people who have felt like they were losing their grip. It's not you. It's the soup. The ingredients changed.
The ingredients changed, and you're just trying to adjust the recipe. That takes time, and it takes patience.
Alex, thank you for breaking down the science so clearly. It's dense stuff, binding globulins and neurosteroids, but it matters because it explains the why behind the suffering.
It was my pleasure. Understanding the mechanism is the first step to getting control back.
If you know someone navigating the tricky waters of hormones and autoimmunity, or if this episode helped you connect the dots on your health, pass it along. Sometimes the right information is the best medicine we have.